So today we are very happy to have invited the Honourable Mr. Shaoquett Moselmane, Member of the Parliament of New South Wales, Parliament of Australia, to be here again at East China Normal University to be visiting the Australian Studies Centre at East China Normal University. Mr. Moselmane just gave an excellent talk to students and staff at the Centre of Australian Studies at my university. And it is indeed rare and a very valuable chance for students and staff to listen to Mr. Moselmane's opinions about China-Australia relations. And really, it's a very warm welcome to you, Mr. Moselmane.
Thank you, Professor Chen, and I'd just like to thank you again. It was a great opportunity speaking to the students who had great knowledge of the Australia-China relationship, and we are here really at a very important juncture in terms of Australia-China relationship. So this is a timely discussion, and I thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you to be here. Mr. Moselmane, actually, as you just mentioned, this is indeed a kind of like juncture of China-Australia relations. Indeed, actually, as we have been, reading and experiencing, there has been a kind of like difficulties between China and Australia, in particular the diplomatic relationship. There has been a sort of like a description of China-Australia relations as in a kind of like a diplomatic freeze. But something it is not only diplomatic; it's sort of like an overall freeze of the bilateral relations. Yesterday, of course, President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea, they met. Yeah. And if these people can be meeting, shaking hands, exchanging views candidly, why can't Malcolm Turnbull and the Chinese leadership, to meet and exchange ideas? So it's not just a kind of like a diplomatic freeze. It's a kind of like a national bilateral, relations freeze. So what do you actually characterize today's relationship between China and Australia, in particular, in relevance to the present-day situation?
Look, I don't think it's a diplomatic freeze in that sense. There's still dialogue happening, but it is another bump on the road, given the history of Australia-China relationship since the 1950s and since 1949. Yeah. There has been significant changes over time. Australia-China relationships have developed from non-recognition to recognition under Whitlam government in '72, and there's been exponential growth in relationship between Australia and China. There's no doubt about that. There's a trade relationship that's grown,
still growing,
phenomenally, to the benefit of both countries, but particularly to Australia, and Australia is really appreciative of that. The Australian people are appreciative of that. But also there's the political aspect of that relationship, and that political aspect has created over the years some bumps in the road. But I think as we've overcome many difficulties in the last 50, 60 years, Australia-China relationship remains strong. And I think now, given 70 years have passed since the 1949 revolution, Australia has great respect for China and the Chinese people. There are elements that perhaps want to play on divisions, but reality is that there's strong relationship between people to people and a strong relationship in governmental terms. And Australia, although at this point there are some tensions, and the tensions are clear, and I know that there's this issue of foreign interference legislation that I'm sure you'll talk about. That comes as a result of a number of things, a number of influences, not only internal but external as well, but also as a result of advice, that agencies' advice that tells us that, frankly, there are apparently espionage, and there's issues that are questionable by the Australian government, questions the potential interference in Australian political affairs. Now, this interference bill that's coming up to be debated next week and to be voted on does not identify China, and that's a fact. So the legislation could have impact not only on China but on other countries who may interfere in the affairs of the Australian political system, the government, and and the legislators. So it's a wide spectrum, but it's not necessarily identified on China. Although we know that the debate that has taken place in recent times it seems to put it squarely on China, but the legislators will tell you that it's not intended to be targeted at the Chinese. I know the Chinese government are not happy, and as you say, there is a freeze. Yes, there has been as I'm told, informed by colleagues that I have here in China, that some of there hasn't really been a greater exchange of political visitations between Australia and China as it used to be prior to this. But as I say, this may be another bump on the road, but hopefully we'll overcome this bump and we'll go back to a working relationship.
Yeah, I think actually from China's point of view, the legislation is totally Australia's internal affair. So China won't be actually interfering about the legislation itself. But actually, the problem is about the target of the rhetoric, which is targeted at China. You know, as the Premier of Western Australia, the state of Western Australia, just said, he said words are bullets. You know, if actually from all fronts actually in Australia, there are politicians, the media, to be targeting China as a kind of like with hostility, as if, China is a kind of like a enemy, that can really be, stirring up a kind of like a negative, responses or feelings towards Australia. And that is actually quite bad to our bilateral relations. Yeah. So as you said, actually, the road can be bumpy. So what do you think we can do to repair the roads? What kind of road work we can do to repair the roads so that actually we can have a better thoroughfare towards a better future?
Yeah, I think, look, frank and open dialogue between the two parties would resolve a lot of issues, will settle a lot of concerns that the governments might have on either side. As you say, it's certainly words are bullets, and it can be not only bullets, but it can be swords, and they can be very effective cutting off relationships, and they can have that impact. Yes, there are political players in Australian political system, whether it's the media or politicians and others, will play the division and will accentuate that supposed division between Australia and China for whatever political interests that they might have. So Australia and China on the diplomatic, on the higher level, should bypass this rhetoric and really sit on a table discussion and resolve those issues. As I said, the legislation, as far as I understand it, it's a federal legislation. It's not a state legislation where I come from, but this legislation is not aimed at any particular country. We know that the talk is that it's China and that there's the Chinese espionage and so forth. But if you look at some of the words, it does not identify China in any way, shape or form. But it is significant in the sense that anybody who influences or tries to influence or intervenes and cause adverse impact on the national interests of Australia could be charged with criminal offences. And the offence could be up to 20 years. So this is a landmark legislation for internal Australian affairs, noting that we are coming to an election. Turnbull is under severe pressure. He has failed. I'm a member of the Labor Party, so I can talk a bit more about the Turnbull government. He's failed in the last 30 polls to win a poll. He's in danger of losing his elections, and upping the ante on the foreign influence, if you like, wins some right-wing votes. Don't want to be cynical, but that's part of parcel of the Australian political processes. Having said that, again, if governments, Labor or Liberal, or whatever nature government you have in Australia, if it receives advice that that there are threats to Australian security, then, as in this case, there's a bipartisan support for legislation that seeks to protect Australia, as China would do, as any country would do when it feels that there's a sense that there's a potential threat to its security and the security of its people. So that's a normal reaction of governments. Whether, as I said, whether if the advice was given that that the Australian government is undertaking certain espionage and interference in the Chinese affairs, then obviously there would be backlash by the Chinese government on Australia. And so one should turn it around and to put themselves in the other foot, if you like, to understand the other partners. And on top of all that, as you know, in the current global tension that we have, China is on the rise, second biggest economy in the world, competing against the United States and Europe and others. There's real tension there. There's, in particular now when you've got Trump, whose policies are so wild that there's no sense of continuum, if you like, knowing where Trump would go next. There's, in that environment, that's created that sense of tension amongst countries. And unfortunate that this current state between Australia and China has not taken a turn for the better, it's taken a turn for the worse. But hopefully, as I say, it's a bump in the road that we will overcome.
Yeah, indeed. Because last year, there was talk about political donation, and then it was about Chinese students' attitudes towards some certain issues. And now we're talking, we're actually reading newspapers and looking at those incriminalization of the Confucius Institutes as being a sort of like a demonized and sort of like a kind of like politicized branch of the Chinese, threat. So this seems to be going on, no end. It seems, if we talk about interest groups, Chinese interest groups, to be arguing or fighting for the Chinese interest, there is really interest group too, who are actually arguing and fighting for Israelis, ideas and their interests. So, do you think actually there will be a kind of like measures to be taken against Israeli groups? So it seems like China has been singled out, and there are kind of like double standard being applied.
I hear what you're saying. It's it is unfortunate that there's been an overreaction, which appears in some media that it's almost like a witch hunt against the certain sections of the Australian multicultural society. In this point, it's the Chinese community targeting the Confucius Studies Institute, targeting students, targeting Australians of Chinese descent. All unacceptable. All unacceptable. I mean, we have many community groups. Australia is a real multicultural society, and we have groups that identify with their countries of origin, but are more than loyal to Australia, and we should not be questioning their loyalty. So we have U.S. studies centers. We have other studies centers from different countries, different influence groups, different groups that. Yes, they are not, at this point, they're not targeted, and I can understand the frustrations in what you say as well. But it seems, yes, and I agree with you, that I'll say it in one respect, sometimes they see the tree but not the forest. So they see the Chinese, but there's a forest of influence of players. Israeli is a big... designs organizations in Australia that plays a big role in influencing decisions on how Australia votes. We look at the recent vote at the United Nations, where Australia voted with the US against sending against an inquiry into the killing of innocent civilians, Palestinians protesting peacefully, and referring that to the Human Rights Commission, and voted against it. We in Australia are strong supporters of human rights, Human Rights Commission and so forth, here we are, because of the influence of the lobby groups in Australia, we have Australia voting against what is fundamentally the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And so yes, so as I say, they see the tree, but they don't see the forest. But again, I go back to my point that this legislation does not target any country, so it may capture other players, and I hope it does capture other players to show that to ensure that as an Australian politician, the safety and concerns of our country comes first, and those who are disloyal pay the penalty, but not to target at any particular community. I know for a fact, as a long-term friend of the Australian Chinese community, there's 1.2 million Australians of Chinese descent whose migration has been there for the last 200 years, which we recently celebrated. They should not feel under that sense of threat, that sense of isolation, that they are targeted, when in reality they are, like every other Australian citizen, working hard and ensuring that they are part and parcel of the Australian wider Australian society.
Yeah.
So it is unfair to perhaps have that perception, but in the Australian political sphere at the moment, sadly, there are certain elements within the political system that are targeting the Chinese. We in the Labor Party oppose that. I strongly oppose that.
But there has been a kind of like bipartisan support to the legislation itself.
This legislation, there will be bipartisan support, but in terms of dealing with having protecting the Australian Chinese community, that's another element altogether. There's a great support for the Australian Chinese community by the Labor Party. The Labor Party has strong links with the Chinese community. The Labor Party, as you've heard me in that in the presentation, through Gough Whitlam, we're proud to have that association with China and the People's Republic of China, which we have great respect for.
Yeah, which has been sustaining. Yes.
Yes, I certainly have that great respect. And given that what China was 70 years ago, from real poverty, the sick man of Asia, for China, after 70 years, a short period of time, to become the second biggest economy is
miraculous.
Many people have to be congratulated for such a great achievement. So, you know, I hope again that bump on the road we will be able to bypass.
Okay, as you said, actually, talking about partisanship, you know, there's this imminent election going on first at the state level and then at the federal level. So, what do you think the Labour's foreign policy, in particular in relation towards China, towards the United States in the so-called Indo-Pacific area, what is actually Labour's stance towards that? Do you think actually, do you foresee a kind of like defrostation or kind of even a kind of warming up, a kind of improvement of bilateral relations?
There's an elections coming up, and other influences. Has played heavily in the media this aspect of division or tension with China. I think the Labor Party will probably have handled it differently to the conservative liberals. Conservative liberal forces over the years have always played on the tensions or generated tensions. Given the example of John Howard, for example, played strongly on the anti-Asian migration and the yellow peril and all these policies that allowed one nation to grow. The Pauline Hanson's one nation to grow, and a certain base of voters who vote for these conservative political parties have identified with those views. The Pauline Hanson right-wing pro-Western civilization view of the world, and whereas the Labor Party see itself as part of Asia, as part of, and reality is we are part of Asia. We're in the Oceania area, we're in the Asia-Pacific region. This was clearly identified and was the policy of Gough Whitlam, who was carried right through Bob Hawke right through to Paul Keating and Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. And so you can see there's a continuum of good Labour policy towards China because it is in our interest, in Australia-China, Chinese interest to have a good working relationship, not only economic, but political, diplomatic, and for security as well.
Yes.
The security of the region means security for all people in the Asia-Pacific region.
That's very well put. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.